He was a real estate tycoon with expensive tastes.
He wanted people to know that he had money, that he was successful.
He's the kind of person that when he came in the room, you knew he had come in the room.
Until his mile-high ambitions came crashing down to earth.
For someone to be literally blown up in a high-profile, high-end Tucson resort was very attention-grabbing.
The investigation would delve into the exclusive world of Tucson's rich and famous to catch an assassin out to make a killing.
The story is the epitome of American greed.
Friday, November 1st, 1996. It's a little after 5 p.m., and Tucson's leisure class is kicking off the weekend with a round of golf. The players are among the city's most rich and powerful, and the biggest name on the course is 52-year-old Gary Triano.
Gary Triano was a very charismatic personality. He was sort of a larger-than-life real estate mogul.
Every Friday, he would be out on the course with people he was trying to get to invest in his latest venture.
But this time, Gary's wheeling and dealing ends with a bang.
At the end of the golfing, he came back to his car, and when he got into his car, the bomb went off.
The explosion is described as like a funnel cloud that can be seen for miles from this resort.
The roof has been peeled off the car by the explosive force. The doors have been blown open. The windshield's gone.
It looked like somebody had just crushed this Lincoln Continental like a matchbox.
First responders quickly arrive, but 52-year-old father and businessman Gary Triano is pronounced dead at the scene.
There was no chance that Gary was going to survive this explosion. He was right on top of it.
How could somebody hate somebody so much to want to murder them in such a violent and public way?
Gary Triano was a longtime resident of Tucson who'd grown up with dreams of making it big.
He was a Tucson kid, went to the University of Arizona, was in business with his father, if I remember right, selling cars in the beginning.
Gary was first married to Mary Cram, and they were a very, very powerful couple, I would say. They had 2 children.
By the early 80s, Gary had closed enough deals to become Tucson's leading real estate developer.
If you were someone who was involved in the financial business in Tucson, Gary Triano was somebody you would have known.
Gary was very flamboyant. He was a high roller. When he had money, he would spend money. He would tip lavishly. He would go on long trips to Europe.
But Gary also took care of those less fortunate.
Gary was very philanthropic, and he believed in the Boys and Girls Club here. He was very, very good to this community.
In 1986, Gary's reputation earned him the attention of another Tucson luminary, Pamela Phillips.
But Pam was, kind of up by the bootstraps gal from Tucson.
She wanted to be one of the first females that was in commercial real estate in Tucson. And she achieved that. She made it all the way to the top.
Gary hosted numerous parties, and friends tell me that she would go to these parties, and that's how they met.
She sort of crashed the party, zeroed in on Gary. They had a whirlwind romance. They get married right away. They have a very lavish wedding. It's a black tie affair on a yacht in San Diego.
He left Mary to get married to Pamela Phillips.
They were kind of a power couple. in Tucson. Donald Trump came here at one point with Marlo Maples and stayed with them for about a month.
They became friends and later went down to Mar-a-Lago.
They become part of that jet set where they're flying off to, have lunch in Greece or flying to his estate in Florida.
But in the early 90s, Gary and Pam's jet-setting days came to a sudden end.
He was, tapped out. I mean, all those wonderful jet trips cost a lot of money.
She realizes that her marriage is not what she believed it to be when she's pregnant with her first child. But 2 kids into the marriage, she's now having to put up her own money to keep Gary afloat.
Gary was forced out of one of the Indian gaming businesses at the time, and once he was forced out of that, as well as some of the real estate things that were going on, Gary lost money and ended up having to file for bankruptcy.
Gary started getting into real trouble financially, and I think Pam got very scared for her and her children's safety because of that. And I think that's what finally triggered the divorce.
I mean, they were not happy with each other. So she takes the kids and takes off to Aspen. He's gone through a bankruptcy. He is living in a spare bedroom of a friend of his. He's driving a borrowed car. He's more down and out than he's been for quite a while.
In spite of these setbacks, Gary was determined to turn his life around.
Gary was the type of guy that he would never give up, and even though he was down today, there was a real good chance that by next year he'd be back on top.
He wanted to convey the image and the message that he was making some kind of a comeback.
But he would never get the chance. Someone had made sure Gary never climbed back to the top, and Tucson police are determined to find out who.
Everybody was in total disbelief. This is the kind of stuff that you read about, you see it on TV, but you don't think it's going to happen to you.
This is not only a who-did-it case and a how-done-it case. What would drive somebody to do this?
Coming up, Gary Triano was deeper in the hole than anyone realized.
When reporters asked the sheriff if there are any suspects, Sheriff Dupnik said, "Open the phone book."
Millionaire real estate developer Gary Triano has been killed by a car bomb outside of Tucson's exclusive La Paloma Country Club. Police arrive to find the area in complete chaos.
It's really hectic because you've got bits and pieces of the car all over the parking lot. You've got golfers and employees wandering out now into the crime scene. It's pandemonium.
Initially, what we do is we totally contain the scene. So in other words, we shut down the entire country club. What you see initially when you actually go to the blast scene is there's a Lincoln Town car sitting parked in a parking space. The roof has been peeled off the car by the explosive force. The doors have been blown open. The windshield was blown out of the car over the trees and landed in the swimming pool.
There were parts of the car up on the roofs of the buildings nearby.
To see a major, massively destructive blast like this was a first for me. I mean, this would be the world's biggest jigsaw puzzle, with no picture of what the puzzle was.
The crime scene is so complex, federal agents are brought in to assist the investigation. Over the next few days, they are able to reconstruct the bombing.
It's not just the sheriff's department at that point, but they call in assistance from the Tucson Police Department bomb squad, ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The FBI comes in.
The ATF guys, they took all the pieces of the material back to their lab in California, and they started telling us about how it was a pipe bomb.
The bomb looked like it had been sort of like it was an amateur had done it. You know, it was a 17-inch pipe bomb, which was already a strange measurement for a pipe bomb.
The device was actually overbuilt for its purpose. It was far more explosive power than was needed. Our belief was it was built off the instructions off the internet and probably wasn't built to the specifics of killing a sole occupant of a vehicle.
The bomb itself, we were able to determine, was housed in a canvas bag, a mundane canvas bag, easily purchased. Through interviews, we knew that Gary very rarely locked his car, so it was not hard to believe that the killer just opened the car door, placed the bag with the bomb in it.
What we didn't know is what detonated the device. Was it motion activated? Was it on a timer? Or was it command detonated?
Eventually, what ATF is able to determine is that it was remote controlled. The killer was probably within 100 yards, laying in wait with his remote detonator.
And that told us that the killer had to be in the parking lot. They had to watch Gary get into the car that night before they detonated the bomb.
And the bombers set their trap for Gary during his birthday weekend.
It was his birthday, and there was a celebration for him that weekend. So he may very well have thought that this was somebody, a friend, that dropped off a birthday present for him.
The golf outing had been prearranged so that the family knew where he was going to be and when he would be coming back home.
They were waiting, all excited to surprise him, and instead, their surprise turned into a nightmare. Had to have been somebody who knew Gary, knew his habits.
He had to sit there patiently waiting after he planted the device in the car. And then once he saw Mr. Triano get in the car, he pulls the trigger.
It's pretty evil when you think about it.
When investigators speak to Gary's family, they say he's made more than a few enemies over the years.
What we found out pretty soon was that Gary had a lot of business dealings, but he currently was in a large amount of debt, over $26 million in debt.
It was clear by the end of his life that he was spending a lot of money he didn't have.
Gary had lots of friends in high places, and he was able to sort of, rob Peter to pay Paul. He was always doing a sort of shell game where he was shuffling money around.
Gary's ex-wife believes one of those enemies decided to get payback.
When Pam and I met at the sheriff's department, she talked a lot about the Indian gaming and about threats as a result of the Indian gaming.
She believes that Gary, was involved in all kinds of nefarious dealings and that it had to have been organized crime somehow.
She said he was on a hit list, and she was scared. And I never saw her scared.
We talked to numerous people who told us that Gary had mentioned to them that he felt like he was being followed. We never were able to get anything that we felt like we could follow up on as far as identifying who that might be.
If you owe money to the mob, they kill you publicly so other people get the message.
Coming up, a shocking tip leads investigators across state lines.
When you take all the information that was found, you can't ignore it. It's almost like this guy has got his shopping list to murder Gary Triano.
Tucson police are investigating the murder of 52-year-old real estate mogul Gary Triano, and the evidence so far suggests his killer might be connected to the mafia.
Tucson is the place that a lot of reputed mobsters have retired in because they consider it safe. It's kind of off the beaten path a little bit. The Bonanno family retired there. The Castellanos retired there.
The idea that it was a mob hit, it came from the fact that it was a car bombing.
When you think of a car bomb, you think of sort of East Coast mafia, mob kind of thing.
With over $25 million in unpaid debts, the list of suspects seems endless.
Gary had borrowed money from a lot of different people. There were investors in Mexico that some people thought were, less than reputable. he had actually started negotiations with a group in China.
Gary Triano not only owed $4.5 million to casinos in Las Vegas, he was threatening a lawsuit against a guy named Gary Fears in St. Louis.
Gary had so many enemies that, it would have been easier to find out who wanted to keep him alive than want him dead.
Detectives track down every possible lead, but despite his suspicious business dealings, they keep coming up empty-handed.
In the days and weeks after the bombing, detectives are interviewing every known associate of Gary Triano that they can find.
You follow out the thread of organized crime. You follow out the thread of a person who was financially crippled by Mr. Triano's failed financial advice. And as you followed each of those out through the investigation, they all just went away. There was nothing in his life that when you took it and amassed it and put it together that led to a motive for murder.
Then, just as the investigation seems to hit a dead end, the Pima County Sheriff's Office receives some unexpected help.
It was national news, and that first week after the bombing, I got a message to call a detective in Aspen, Colorado. And that's when I first met Detective Jim Crowley. Detective Crowley talked to me about a fraud investigation that he was involved in, that Ron Young was the principal suspect.
He was a businessman who was really more of a confidence man.
Investigators learned that 7 months before Gary Triano's murder, Aspen authorities were preparing to bring in Ron Young on fraud charges. He disappeared before they got the chance.
He was on the run. He was on the run because he had a warrant out for his arrest.
Ron Young had rented a van using a fictitious credit card. And result of that, the van was reported stolen.
The van stolen in Aspen had turned up in California 1 month before the murder, and it appears to contain new evidence investigators now realize is connected to Gary's murder.
In October of 1996, in Brea, California, some neighbors report a van that's been parked on their street in a cul-de-sac for a few days. They call the local law enforcement. The cop sees it as a stolen vehicle, and they call the detective up in Aspen that had taken the stolen report and say, we got this van, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in it that we have no idea what this means.
Jim Crowley, the detective from Aspen, searches the van, and in it he finds a sawed-off shotgun. He finds notes that list close relations or friends of Gary Triano. He finds a map of Tucson.
Detective Crowley says, hey, I saw the bombing on the news, and I think that bombing is related to a fraud case that I've been working in Aspen.
He knew that he had to get a hold of us and share his information with our investigation.
When Tucson detectives inspect the van's contents, they find more clues connecting Ron to the bombing.
We went back to all the contents of the van and really delved into them. And that's when we found friends and relatives, car descriptions, car license plates of friends and family close to Gary Triano.
They've got receipts from a hotel here in Tucson that was in close proximity of where the Triano house was.
We went to the hotel and went through all their receipts from 1996 and were able to show that Ron had stayed in this hotel here in Tucson for about a week prior to the murder.
It's quite possible when Gary told his friend that he felt somebody was following him, it was Ronald Young.
But why would a con man from Aspen murder a struggling Tucson real estate developer?
It's all very suspicious, but where's the motive? At this point, Ron Young has just disappeared. He is nowhere to be found. He has gone off the maps.
Coming up, investigators follow the money to find the missing pieces of the puzzle.
In other words, who benefited financially from Gary's death?
Thanks to a call from the Aspen Police Department, investigators in Tucson have discovered that a con man named Ronald Young was targeting Gary Triano. The question is, why? As detectives in Arizona and Colorado compare notes, they realize the two men share a personal connection.
Jim Crowley, a detective with the Aspen Police Department, he said, I happen to have interest in Pam Phillips, who is Gary Triano's ex-wife.
Before the bombing happens, Detective Crawley gets an interesting phone call from Pam Phillips about a year prior. Pam Phillips calls him up because Pam has realized that she's just been defrauded, bilked out of $300,000 by Ron.
She called me and said, yeah, I just got taken and this guy just, took all my money.
But it seems Pam had quickly withdrawn the accusation.
Crowley goes into depth that publicly she cried wolf, that Ron Young had done these horrible financial things to me, but wouldn't go on record and wouldn't file a report with the Aspen Police Department.
Meanwhile, Ron and her kind of make up, and she strangely calls Detective Cowley and says, you know what, it was my mistake. I made an accounting error, and I don't want to press charges anymore.
I'd ask her about him, and she'd just turn her head and walk away. She never, ever said his name again.
Pam's friends think they know why. According to them, the two had started out as business partners about a year after her divorce, but their relationship wasn't strictly professional.
Initially, their relationship is sort of a teacher-pupil relationship. Ron is making himself useful in Pam's life. He's taking care of her business, and their relationship sort of morphs into more than a business arrangement.
And it came out that she was romantically involved with Ronald Young in Aspen.
Every once in a while, they'll have drinks too late, and Ron will wind up asleep on the couch, sometimes then wanders into the bedroom.
I think Pam used her beauty and sex for men in that way. That was her tool.
Investigators now know that Pam is the connection between Ron and Gary Triano. But had Ron been using her to get to her husband? Or was Pam in on the plot?
It could be, certainly, that Ron Young had sort of looked into Pam Phillips's background, collected a lot of information about her and her ex-husband to try to perpetrate some further fraud on her.
The big question that remained for Detective Gamber was, did he work alone? Did Ron Young do this on his own?
To test Pam, investigators ask her to come in for an interview.
During the interview, I didn't want her to know how much I knew about Ron. So when I pretty much nonchalantly threw his name out, there was just a long pause.
She's denying his relationship with her. She completely minimizes him and their relationship to the point of, how did you hear about him?
Outwardly, she appeared to cooperate with the investigation. It wasn't until we asked her if she would take a polygraph that she started some more pausing and some more, no, I don't know if I want to do that.
Police find Pam's behavior suspicious, but she and Gary were already divorced. So what motive would she have for killing him?
We have to follow the money. And where it got interesting is when we started to look at Pam Phillips.
We had pulled the divorce records, and we knew that there were a lot of issues. The divorce wasn't smooth. There was fight over the children. There was allegations that Gary was hiding money.
This is a time when Pam is running out of money. I mean, she tells the au pair at one point that she's down to her last $60,000.
As investigators dig deeper, they discover that Pam still stood to gain a lot from Gary's death.
The detectives are doing their due diligence. They do find out about the insurance policy that Pam Phillips had on Gary's life, that she maintained even after the divorce.
The insurance policy consisted of a $2 million life insurance. I was told, and then we were able to confirm through records, that the children were the beneficiaries.
But the children are minors, and so Pam's the guardian, of course, so she's getting the money.
Pam took that money and bought her first house with it in Aspen. I was invited over there to go house hunting with her.
It's like who had the most to benefit and who had the motive. And Pam Phillips had the motive.
But investigators know it's still not enough to make an arrest.
So the really frustrating part about this case is that, they have all of this evidence, but there's too many loose ends.
Pam Phillips was definitely a potential suspect. However, one of the main people that we wanted to talk to was a fugitive, and he was nowhere to be found.
By November of 1997, the case has come to a complete standstill. Detectives begin to wonder if it will ever be solved.
We revisit the story on the 1-year anniversary. Still no arrests, no one in custody, no person of interest, nothing, nada.
The only really unknown at the end of the task force was we needed to talk to Ron Young.
Coming up, the hunt for the missing con man finally ends.
So after this long 9-year hiatus, they finally get the tip.
Nearly a decade after the murder of Gary Triano, detectives are still focused on 2 suspects, Pamela Phillips and Ron Young. But they still don't have enough evidence to charge either of them, and Ron is still in hiding.
Everybody worked this case down to the last possible lead, and then we were left, where's Ron Young?
In November of 2005, investigators decide to make one last attempt to draw Ron out.
I mean, there's this push that we need to do something on it. The sheriff's department really wants to solve this case.
When the thought of America's Most Wanted came up, it seemed like a logical way to at least try to locate him.
It really hit the national spotlight when it debuted. It just kind of let everybody know to be on the lookout for this man who is a person of interest, Ronald Young.
The episode airs on November 19th. Within 24 hours, Tucson police get the tip they were hoping for.
What happened was Ron Young's chiropractor in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, called in and said, Ron, this guy is a patient of mine, but he's a patient under a different name.
Not only is he a client, but he's got an appointment that morning. So there is this scramble for the fugitive detail in Broward County to set up outside this chiropractor's office. Sure enough, Ron Young comes up in a taxi and is immediately apprehended.
With Ron finally in custody, investigators swiftly execute a search warrant for his apartment and vehicle.
There are boxes and boxes of, all sorts of things, floppy disks, thumb drives, hard drives, paper receipts. There is just this treasure trove of information.
As the recordings were analyzed, as the computer was analyzed, it was evident that they had a financial relationship.
The evidence that's becoming clear is that Ron Young is owed $400,000 by Pam Phillips for a job that he did for her.
He's meticulously, like an accountant, kept track of every payment.
Over the course of years, there are tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash that Pam Phillips is sending to Ron Young. That's obviously huge evidence, but it's the phone calls that Ron Young has been recording between the two of them that ultimately is the downfall for both of them.
When investigators listen to the tapes, they immediately recognize the two voices.
We took one of the micro cassettes, put it into a recorder, and started to play it, and instantly you heard Ron Young's voice, and he was talking to Pam Phillips.
I can't really talk right now, but I put something in the mail. Thanks, bye.
And the minute I heard her voice, I knew that he was talking on the phone with Pam Phillips. And at that point, I just said, this has got to be the answer. Probably one of the most damning recordings was when there was an argument over the money, how much she was sending, how much she wasn't sending.
I'm like cashless. I need to restructure, reorganize, do something. You know what? I just can't handle this. I really can't. It's too dangerous.
She argues with him, says, I've paid you enough. And Ron Young says, you will pay me the rest of my money or you will be in prison for murder. And her response is, so will you.
That's when I said, okay, we've got him.
But when Aspen police try to arrest Pamela, they discover she's now on the run.
After the indictment came down, they found that she had left for Europe.
What we know is that she took a flight that took her through Atlanta, then on to Gatwick Airport in London, and then possibly on to Munich. And that's all we know.
To track her down, detectives enlist the aid of Interpol.
They start conducting a European investigation on her. And about 1 year later, I get a call, and it's basically Pam is in custody in Vienna, Austria.
The way that they track her down, in a very ironic, almost coincidental scenario, is she stiffs her limousine driver.
She didn't pay him one time, and the guy went to the police there. And that's how she got caught.
She has again found herself a man, a rich man, to align with. And she's living the high life again. She has literally reinvented herself in Vienna, Austria.
On July 2nd, 2010, Pam is finally taken into custody at the Tucson International Airport.
What was reported to me is her comment was, if Gamber's in the airport, I'm not getting off the plane. Then she gets handed over to me. So it was a good feeling.
I kept asking her questions the whole time until she got into the detective's car. And I said, well, how does it feel to be back in Tucson? And she looked at me and she said, it's very hot. Well, it got a lot hotter.
Coming up, Gary's accused killers finally stand trial. But will a jury convict them?
I knew it was only the beginning. The investigation was going to go under a microscope.
Nearly 18 years after the murder of real estate tycoon Gary Triano, prosecutors in Tucson, Arizona have finally charged two co-conspirators with the crime. Gary's ex-wife, Pamela Phillips, and her ex-lover, Ron Young. The trials begin with Ron Young in February of 2010.
The evidence is, the recordings, all the evidence that he'd saved.
He makes a trip to Tucson, and he stalks Gary, and he learns about his habits.
Ron Young had established Gary's pattern of going to the La Paloma Country Club. He constructed the device. He planted it in the car. He sat back and he waited for Gary Triano's golf game to end, and that's when he hit the detonate button.
The public defender's office just said that the state's case was very circumstantial and didn't rise to the level of beyond a reasonable doubt.
But the jury disagrees. Ron is found guilty.
Ron never admitted to anything. He professed his innocence throughout the trial. It was the jury that came back and decided that he was involved in this.
4 years later, it's Pamela's turn to face a jury.
Before she goes to trial, the judge deemed that she was incompetent to stand trial. So she goes through all these tests and she goes through all this rehabilitation to get her competent to stand trial.
Basically, the prosecution theory of the case is that Ron Young was hired by Pam Phillips to kill Gary Triano.
They wind up getting into an arrangement where Pam convinces Ron that she's got this $2 million life insurance policy, and that if he carries out this hit on Gary, she'll pay him $400,000.
According to the DA, the meticulous notes Ron kept are more than enough proof of Pam's involvement.
She gets the money from the insurance claim early 1997, and she starts paying Ron Young these payments shortly thereafter. We're talking $400,000, and it's being paid out in bits and pieces. You know, it was very suspicious.
He was doing work for her, trying to help her start this business called Star Babies. And he wanted the money sent to him in a wire transactions that were kind of separated and hidden, and it looked bad.
But that isn't the only evidence linking Pamela to the murder. On February 27th, prosecutors call a new witness to the stand.
Pam has a best friend of hers, Laura Chapman, who is the prosecution's surprise witness.
After Ron Young's trial, and he's convicted, Laura Chapman comes forward.
She says, you know, Pam told me before Gary was murdered that when they were having marital problems, that Pam should just hire a hitman and take him out. That became sort of the smoking gun of Pam Phillips' trial.
However, the defense argues that none of it proves Pam is guilty of murder.
They could never really place her at the scene of the crime, you know, so they have to link her to Ron, and they have to link her through emails and things that can be interpreted differently.
In fact, Pam's attorneys have their own theory about who killed Gary.
The whole defense was geared toward this dead billionaire in Tucson that had a beef with Gary Triano.
The person we think was involved with this case was a guy named Neil McNeese. Neil McNeese had been threatening to kill Gary Triano for a number of years. We all know as trial lawyers that if you do a third-party culpability, it's your story versus the state's theory of the case. It's not about reasonable doubt anymore. It's about whose theory the jury believes.
As the jury deliberates, it's anyone's guess which story they will believe.
You're always nervous about whether or not you were able to come up with enough evidence that the jury would agree with your theory of the case.
On April 8th, 2014, they return with their verdict.
She's guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and first-degree murder. And her sentence is natural life in prison, which in Arizona means that's life without parole.
It wasn't until we got the verdict that I breathed a sigh of relief. That was probably the most gratification that most homicide detectives get on a case.
Gary's children were there, his ex-wife was there, his brother, and there was just this sense of relief. I mean, after almost 2 decades, they finally felt that they got some measure of justice.
An insatiable desire for the finer things in life had driven Pam to gamble on the perfect murder. Instead, she'd lost everything.
There was, I think, some sadness that Pam Phillips, she didn't have to do this. She was not destitute by any means.
Pam orchestrated this murder absolutely out of revenge, but also just plain and simple greed. She was told that she was going to live a lavish lifestyle, be part of the rich and famous, be this elite socialite. It just sort of epitomized the ugly side of American greed. You know, what would somebody do for money?
two outdoorsmen devoted to the same piece of land.
It was beautiful. It was like God's country.
This is Montana. Montana has a strong, strong heritage of having a firearm, protecting your life and your property.
They started really kind of butting heads. We always felt someone was going to pull the trigger.
Their feud would escalate into an armed standoff that left one of them dead.
One of them's down. We need somebody up there now.
But is it a case of self-defense or a cover-up for murder?
He said the next time you see him, you're going to see him in a body bag.
Friday, October 18th, 2013. It's a beautiful fall day in the Flathead National Forest, located near Great Falls, Montana.
It is sort of a gateway to a very desirable wilderness area that people here just love to flock to, and that would be the Rocky Mountain front.
But at 12:20 p.m., the tranquility is disturbed when Montana police receive a call from Tanny Converse, a resident of Diamond Bar X.
911, what is your emergency?
Hi, we need the Lewis and Clark County Sheriff to come up the Upper Dearborn, up Falls Creek, having a altercation with a neighbor, and he's just ranting and raving at us.
Diamond Bar X is a remote community out in the woods. It's over 2 hours away from the sheriff's office in Helena, so dispatch sends a deputy from Augusta.
But before the deputy can get to the location, Tanny calls again.
She apparently walked to a neighbor's house to call 911, and in the time that passed, the fight had escalated.
The altercation with the neighbor, there were shots fired, and one of them's down. So one of them's down. We need somebody up there now.
When the deputy finally arrives, he finds a man lying motionless near a wooden gate. On the ground beside him is a .38 caliber pistol.
The gun was found laying on the ground 6 to 10 inches from his right hand.
It looked like some sort of gunfight. He'd been shot already once in the chest and lost a lot of blood.
It took some time to get the ambulance personnel there, and they looked at him and said that he had expired.
The dead man is identified as 53-year-old Tim Newman, a longtime resident of the area.
Tim was a gentle soul. He cared for people, helped them out. He was born in California, and his dream was always to live in Montana. His family is in southern Montana, the ranchers and the cowboys, this type of thing.
In 2001, Tim Newman had finally fulfilled his lifelong dream.
He moved to the Great Falls area. He'd been married and divorced once already and had a daughter who lived in Alaska. So he was looking to make a fresh start. He found a cabin that was a bit of a fixer-upper in Diamond Bar X. The area had been named after an old dude ranch that was there before the area was developed.
Tim was drawn to the area, I think, like the rest of us. We liked the outdoors. There was a lot of opportunity up there to hunt, fish, backpack, lots of horse riding trails in the area.
Tim found work in Great Falls, where he met his second wife, Jackie, in 2003.
He was doing some electrical for my niece and her husband, and they got to chit-chatting and found out he was single and I was single, so we did phone tag for a while. And we finally met up at a neutral place, and that was the end of that story.
They had a lot in common. Jackie was also divorced with a kid, and she worked in the food service industry for the local schools.
2 weeks later, He slipped an engagement ring on my finger, and then he stayed with me. We were married that May.
Jackie also fell in love with Tim's cabin. The couple spent most of their weekends there finishing renovations.
We made a masterpiece out of it. Going up there and overlooking the valley. I mean, there's a creek down below. There's a cliff like 2 feet away. But it was like God's country. Just, oh, I can't explain the beauty of it all.
I own and build log cabins for a living, and he was a journeyman electrician. So our relationship started out primarily work-related. Didn't take long, and we became friends.
Tim was a guy that always you could count on to help out, and we were all like that. Everybody just pitched in, and little community.
For Tim and Jackie, it was paradise. But one area in particular held a special place in Tim's heart.
Not far from Diamond Bar X is the Bob Marshall Wilderness, which is one of the most spectacular nature preserves in the country. Locals call it the Bob.
The Bob Marshall's over 1 million acres with no roads, no nothing, so you can go back in there and pretty well lose yourself. When he bought that piece of ground up there with that cabin, what he was looking for was to find a place where he could stage himself for hunting season.
All the trails and roads that led you to the national forest went through neighboring properties. And it was understood, and people enjoyed that. They liked to see their neighbors, go by and would wave and see the horseback trips heading into the mountains.
But that all changed on October 18th, 2013.
It was about a month into the hunting season. Tim and his buddy Joe Aberley were planning another hunting trip together.
Tim and I were going to go into the mountains. He had his horse, and I had mine. We had hunted a couple weeks before in that area. There was a lot of deadfall on the trails. So before hunting season, everyone goes in their area and saws the trees out of the way.
But the trip wouldn't go as planned. Tim had been killed in an apparent gunfight, and police don't have to look very far to find the man who shot him.
They find another man at the scene who's armed as well. He says he owns the property on the other side of the fence and had every right to shoot Tim Newman.
Coming up, locked gates and death threats.
He said, I could shoot you right now, and there's a lot of places in the mountains where somebody would not be found.
"53-year-old Tim Newman has been found shot to death near Diamond Bar X in rural Montana. The news quickly spreads around the tight-knit community.
It was just devastating. I was shocked, and I just had to sit down for a few minutes and kind of wrap my head around it.
The police were still at the scene, so one of Tim's friends wound up being the one to call Jackie to let her know what happened.
He said, Tim's been shot. He's kind of breaking up, and I said, he's been shot, is he okay? And he said, no, he's not okay, he's dead. It was one of those days that you try to forget, but you never do.
It's hard for anyone to believe someone would kill a man like Tim, but police already have the shooter in custody.
His name is Joe Campbell, and his wife is the one who called 911. He claims that Tim tried to shoot him first.
Joe had a gun. He described how it happened, that he had to fire in self-defense.
He did not seem nervous or scared or upset. He seemed very concerned, but he seemed to be able to tell his story in a coherent, cohesive manner.
67-year-old Joe Campbell and his wife Tanny are also longtime residents of Diamond Bar X.
Joe moved into the area in the late 90s. He bought a piece of property like the rest of us did. He built a cabin on it. It did become his full-time residence.
He had worked for the Forest Service in Colorado, then left that job and came up to Montana and bought into that area.
Much like the Newmans, Joe and Tanny had immediately fallen in love with the area.
They walked up the mountain and hiked and horseback ride, and we used to see him back there, and we were cordial.
Joe loved the area so much, in fact, that he began purchasing as much of it as he could.
When the original owner that developed the Diamond Over X passed away, Campbell and another resident bought the remaining property. This property is worth millions.
He ended up owning approximately 300 acres at that point, and it was scattered throughout the development between the development and the forest.
After that, Joe's attitude towards his neighbors seemed to change.
When he got the 300 acres, he was deciding he was going to limit people's access in and out of the forest.
There was a lot of Forest Service land, but to get to that, you had to cross Campbell's land. And that was a contention between the neighbors if they wanted to enjoy the public land. Joe Campbell claimed that they were trespassing on land that he bought.
Some neighbors fired back, calling the police to complain about Joe, and that's when he decided to up the ante.
Joe Campbell began to put padlocks and gates on places that didn't have padlocks and gates.
Joe's tactics made an enemy out of one neighbor in particular, Tim Newman.
Tim was upset about that because we used to just ride out there anytime, and we'd go for miles on the horses and see all the falls.
He felt that they had a historical easement, that they had the right to enjoy unfettered access to those areas to get to the public land.
Tim wasn't going to let Joe win without a fight.
Tim started cutting locks that Joe was putting up on gates to keep people out.
Tim was flexing his muscles by cutting the gates, saying, I'm not going to go through the legal avenues.
Joe then retaliated by pressing charges against Tim.
We began to issue citations to Tim Newman for cutting those locks and the vandalism.
Tim pleaded not guilty, and the charges were later dismissed. That should have been the end of it, but Tim kept doing it, and that turned out to be a big mistake.
Joe definitely was a bully, and I think Tim was poking the bear, so to speak. I think he pushed him.
Joe tells detectives that the feud had continued for over 8 months. But things finally came to a head after he caught Tim trying to cut another one of his locks earlier that day.
Joe and his wife were out for a walk when they saw Tim with a pair of bolt cutters. He told them to stop.
Mr. Campbell had said that Mr. Newman had been taunting Mr. Campbell and Mr. Campbell's wife. He told her to call 911.
After Tanny leaves to go find a phone, things got even more heated. They were yelling back and forth at each other, and then it happened.
The story that Joe gave to the sheriff initially was that Tim had gone for his gun and that Joe had drawn his from his holster up and fired and shot Tim. He had started to roll over to shoot him, and that he had shot him the second time in the back.
It was self-defense. He felt that his life was in danger.
Given the history between the two of them and the charges against Tim, the shooting looked completely justified.
It did initially make sense to all of us who were investigating. The facts that Joe gave us looked plausible.
Coming up, investigators discover there is more to the story than meets the eye.
Joe Campbell had threatened Tim several times.
He wanted to become king of the mountain, and he was going to achieve that any way he could.
A feud over land rights in the Montana wilderness has left 53-year-old Tim Newman dead. So far, it looks like the man who shot him, 67-year-old Joe Campbell, was acting in self-defense.
We investigated the scene. We looked for the bullets. We took measurements. We photographed it, all of those kind of things.
They found a gun near Tim's body and bolt cutters by the fence, which was in line with the story Joe had told police. He seemed to have acted in accordance with Montana's Stand Your Ground laws.
The Stand Your Ground law is that you can defend your property if someone is what you think is going to cause bodily harm.
After detectives questioned Joe at the scene, they let him go. But not everyone is convinced he is telling the truth.
We were expecting he'd be arrested immediately, and he wasn't. And we were all very upset.
Tim wasn't the only one Joe had disagreements with. Over the years, he had several run-ins with other Diamond Bar ex-residents as well.
The neighbors and myself were worried that this guy did it once, he could do it twice.
Residents tell police that Joe Campbell had been using threats and intimidation to keep people off his land for years.
This was a community. They got along well. But when Joe Campbell got there, he just decided that there was a new sheriff in town and he was going to rule the roost.
He wanted to become king of the mountain, and he was going to achieve that any way he could. He pulled guns on people. He bullied people. He was just the kind of a guy that nobody wanted to be a friend with.
Tim's friend Joe Aberly tells investigators that he and his daughter had previously experienced Joe's violent streak firsthand.
We were riding a regular trail we always ride that would take us in front of Campbell's house or past his house, and he came out and challenged us with a shotgun and says, "You're not going past here." And I says, "Yes, I am." And my daughter says, "Dad, stop, he's going to shoot you in the back."
Joe did tell him, "I could shoot you right now, and there's a lot of places in the mountains where somebody would not be found."
Campbell came out this big, actually they call it a sweeper shotgun that you'd use for mob control or slaughtering people. And that's what Campbell presented and stopped these people from going in there.
But Tim Newman is the one who bore the brunt of Joe's animosity.
Joe Campbell had threatened Tim several times to his face and to other people. He threatened to kill him because he was crossing his land.
Tim told me that Mr. Campbell had drawn a weapon on him.
It may have started out with some type of bullying before he actually started pulling out pistols, but this has been going on for several years.
At the time, local police had tried to broker a peace between the two men, but there was only so much they could do.
Confronting people with a gun and behaving in a aggressive manner, that was our business. But as far as who had the right to go on the land, that's something that we could not solve.
We wrote letters saying we were concerned for everyone's safety up there.
We had 10 or 12 families involved in the original lawsuit. Every family put in X amount of dollars, and we gave it to the attorney to research deed access and prescriptive easements.
Unfortunately, a legal battle with a wealthy landowner proved too costly to continue.
Tim and a couple of the other neighbors decided they had had enough as far as the monetary part of it was, and said they were going to pursue other avenues.
Tim decided to cut the locks so he would get charged with trespassing and the case would go to court. Of course, that only made things worse.
The more that Tim Newman asserted his rights for the historical easement, the more that Joe Campbell became aggressive.
We always were concerned that it was going to escalate, and we always felt someone was going to pull the trigger.
Joe and Tim had finally been assigned a date to face each other in court, but it never took place.
The state prosecutor decided it was a civil case and the charges against Tim were dropped. The other residents felt like that was the final straw for Joe Campbell.
So on the morning of October 18th, Joe's neighbors believed he decided to take matters into his own hands.
Tim and his friend were out on the trails clearing brush for their hunting trip, and that's when Joe Campbell showed up.
Tim looked out there, and he said, "Oh, it's Campbell." He said, "I want to go talk to him a minute."
Tim knew that the gate was locked up above, and that was an access that Tim had been using and was upset that the lock was back on it. They had words.
He came back just within half a minute or so, very fast, and very distressed, Tim was. And I says, "What happened?" And he says, "Well, Joe threatened to kill me again."
A couple of hours later, Tim Newman was dead.
So had Joe really shot Tim in self-defense, or had he finally made good on his threats?
Coming up, autopsy results hinted a possible cover-up.
There are several things that just don't add up.
Police investigating the shooting death of Tim Newman have already questioned and released his longtime rival, Joe Campbell. But given the pair's ongoing dispute, they're no longer certain it was in self-defense.
It did not make sense to hear that Tim would have pulled a gun on Joe by any means. I definitely would have expected it the other way around.
Joe had already made threats multiple times.
I knew at that time that Joe Campbell murdered Tim.
Unfortunately, preliminary evidence appears to support Joe's account of the shooting.
There wasn't anything to dispute what Joe said. Well, Montana does have a law of stand your ground.
All the shooter has to do is say, "I was threatened," and say that Tim Newman pulled his weapon.
But there is one minor detail that doesn't fit.
Tim's hunting partner, Joe Aberley, told police that he was saddling their horses when he heard 2 gunshots. He and another neighbor, Mike Dunnington, ran over there and found Tim lying in front of the gate. His gun was on the ground beside him, but they immediately noticed something strange.
I says, "Mike, that gun is laying in front of Tim's right head." "Yeah, I see it, I see it." I said, "Listen, you know Tim is left-handed."
The gun was on his right side. I saw it there. He's left-handed. Now, I doubt if he was doing a cross draw.
If you're going to shoot a weapon, you want to be able to aim that weapon. So, no, it just wasn't logical.
So how did Tim's gun wind up in the wrong hand?
I do think that there's a good chance that that gun was placed there.
The medical examiner's report indicates another problem with Campbell's version of events.
In his first statement to police, Joe said that when Tim drew his gun, he shot him in the chest. He said that Tim had fallen to the ground and then attempted to roll over and fire his weapon, and that's when Joe shot him in the back. But the wounds didn't exactly support that. The autopsy showed that Tim had been shot twice. One bullet grazed him in the hand and then went through his shoulder. The other severed his spine, and that was the shot that killed him. And based on the medical examiner's report, that was also probably the first shot fired.
Was Campbell lying? Or had the 67-year-old simply misremembered what happened in the heat of the moment? On October 28th, 10 days after the shooting, investigators bring Joe Campbell in for a second interview. Campbell sticks by his story, insisting that Newman was the aggressor, both in their feud and on the day of the shooting.
Mr. Newman was following him on an ATV, and taunting them. And they had made efforts to avoid Mr. Newman, but it persisted. And then they came to the fence where the shootings took place. He talked about being feeling threatened, that he felt his life was in danger.
It is his land. He is defending his property. This is Montana. Montana has a strong, strong heritage of having a firearm, protecting your life and your property with a firearm.
Detectives confront Campbell with the discrepancies between his story and the autopsy findings. But he has a simple explanation.
Joe reenacts the whole shooting for them. He shows them how Tim spun around and fell to the ground face first and then pushed himself up with his hands and elbows. He says when Tim tried to get up, he shot him in the back, causing Tim to roll down the hill, exposing his gun. Joe then adds another interesting detail.
As Mr. Newman lay there, he looked up and said, "You shouldn't have done that, Joe," after he was shot, which I thought was a very interesting thing to offer.
To determine what really happened, the sheriff's department will need to call in a forensics expert to reconstruct the shooting.
We weren't seeing any progress. So the delay was very hard. They couldn't tell us a lot. They just said, be patient, we have work to do.
Oh, that was so frustrating, and I had contact with the detective almost every day, just, why haven't they gotten him? Why haven't they gotten him? And she said, we have to dot our I's and cross our T's before we can actually make an arrest.
But before that can happen, the investigation suffers an unexpected setback.
A snowstorm came in and they weren't able to access the area for several months until the snow receded.
There's nothing anyone can do at that point but wait.
Coming up, beneath the snow, the truth lies waiting to be discovered.
The story we were told didn't match the forensics.
His legs were spread as if he were running when the bullet hit him.
It's May of 2014. 7 months have passed since the death of Tim Newman, and his friends are still reeling from the loss.
This had happened to a peaceful area where the neighbors were supposed to get along. It was consuming. It consumed everybody's mindset and their conversations.
Especially since the man who shot him, Joe Campbell, has yet to be charged with a crime.
He'd been free walking around after, shooting somebody. The community was devastated by it, but he was like, no big deal. Today's another day.
We were concerned to go to our property. You were always looking over your shoulder.
Joe would be standing up on the hill, looking down on us working, and he'd be standing up there with a rifle in his hands.
The community began to have unrest because there was no resolution to what they felt we should be doing.
Winter snowstorms had put a hold on the investigation, but with the spring thaw came a chance to revisit the scene of the shooting.
So far, they only had Joe's version of what happened, and the medical examiner's findings didn't exactly line up. They had to go back to the area to find out what really happened.
We had a forensic scientist look at it, analyzed where those bullets entered Tim Newman's body.
The scientist's name is William Schneck. He's a crime scene investigator with the Washington State Crime Lab. Using a mannequin and other specialized forensic tools, he attempts to recreate the shooting based on the evidence gathered so far.
According to Joe Campbell, he shot Tim first in the chest and then in the back. But the nature of Tim's injuries and the position of his body indicated exactly the opposite. Joe said the first shot spun Tim around, but the trajectory of the wounds didn't line up that way.
In fact, Schneck is able to determine that Tim Newman was running away from Joe Campbell when he shot him.
Tim was laying downhill from the gate. Tim's left hand was back, his right hand was forward, and his legs were spread as if he were running when the bullet hit him.
The first shot would have put Tim Newman down. It was in the spine and made him go down. The second shot went in through the shoulder, and you could take the stick or line them up and show where he was when he got shot.
The shooting reconstruction contradicts Joe Campbell's story in other ways, too.
If Tim had been crouched by the gate with his bolt cutters when he went for his gun, like Campbell said, he probably would have dropped them right there. But that's not where police found them.
The story we were told didn't match the forensics of what we now know.
On June 23, 2014, prosecutors filed charges against Joe Campbell. Along with the forensic evidence, they cite Joe's history of conflicts with his neighbors, especially Tim Newman.
The threats against Tim continued right up to his death. In fact, days before the shooting, Joe had made it clear he intended to kill him because the court had dropped the vandalism charges.
Joe Campbell called the judge and said, the next time you see Tim Newman, you're going to see him in a body bag.
Between all of that, the autopsy, and the forensic expert, they have a pretty solid case for murder.
It wasn't how Joe Campbell said it had happened. It wasn't a matter of self-defense, but it's up to a jury to decide.
Later that day, police arrest 68-year-old Joe Campbell for first-degree murder.
He was cooperative. He didn't fight. We had been at this for quite some time. I believe he knew that this day was coming.
One of the county attorneys called me and said they're going to arrest Campbell. And I says, thank you. It was a great relief to all of us.
It was one of the happiest days of my life.
At his arraignment, Joe pleads not guilty. The defense negotiates for his release pending trial. Instead, the judge sets his bond at $1 million.
Joe's lawyers were able to negotiate a lower bond of $300,000 using his house, valued at $680,000, as collateral.
The trial is set for November, a year after Tim Newman's death. But justice would have to wait.
It's taken them months to put together the evidence against Joe Campbell and even more time to bring the case to trial. They missed the November date, and then Joe's legal team changed, which delayed it for another year.
Coming up, Joe Campbell finally stands trial. But will a jury find him guilty?
We knew it was going to be a tough case to prove.
After numerous delays, Joe Campbell finally stands trial on February 15, 2016. More than 2 years after he shot and killed his neighbor, Tim Newman. Joe has already pled not guilty under Montana's Stand Your Ground laws, but prosecutors argue that the evidence proves he was not acting in self-defense.
The prosecution tried to portray Mr. Campbell as somebody who was very angry. They had brought up several witnesses who had said they'd had run-ins with Mr. Campbell over the years. And they also said that there was never these problems before Mr. Campbell arrived on the property.
It wasn't just a deal where they got into a heated argument and pulled guns on each other. This was years in the build-up. They didn't like each other very well, and they had other confrontations. And Joe had made comments to other neighbors and people that he was going to do these things to Tim, and he was able to carry it out.
Their star witness is forensic scientist William Schneck.
It was Schneck who reconstructed the shooting scene, confirming what the autopsy had found, which was that the first and fatal shot to Tim Newman was in the back. The placement of the body and Tim's gun being in the wrong hand, the prosecution argued, all added up to murder. Campbell shot Newman as he was turned away and then staged the scene to make it look like self-defense.
The best evidence against Joe Campbell was a forensic pathology report that showed, I believe, that it was beyond a shadow of a doubt how it really happened.
But the defense has its own expert, Dr. Vincent DeMeo, who lays out a different theory.
The defense expert says it's perfectly plausible that Tim could have been falling or jumping backwards when the first shot hit him in the hand and chest, followed by the second shot that hit him in the back.
He said, well, Tim was leaning backwards. But they said to lean that far backwards, you couldn't possibly stand on 2 feet, you'd fall over backwards. It didn't matter what they said. It didn't work.
Hoping the two experts might cancel each other out, the defense calls on Joe Campbell to tell his story in his own words.
He was emotional on the stand, describing how terrified he was in the moment that Tim reached for his gun, but he had to protect himself.
He's defending his land. He has someone who says that they can trespass and that he is using a firearm to protect his ground.
The crying, I thought, you lying SOB, you dirty SOB, all the bad things you can think. That was a most blatant lie.
I never really quite knew if the tears were real, but I think he came across as credible, and he only has to come across as credible to 1 or 2 people.
On March 3rd, after a 3-week trial, the case goes to the jury.
Well, I thought the prosecution had a very good case. We were cautiously optimistic that he'd be found guilty.
But the jury doesn't agree.
They deliberated for 13 hours, and then they came back and told the judge that they were hopelessly deadlocked.
I was with my wife and Tim's wife, and we just couldn't believe it.
When the jury was polled, they felt like it was a negligent homicide. They weren't comfortable going with the homicide because they felt there were some mitigating factors. The defense had done a good job at creating some doubt.
Now the state had to determine whether they would pursue a retrial or drop the case.
The detective asked me, do you want to retry this case? What do you think? And I said, yes, I do, because I honestly thought we had him this time.
The state decided they would retry him, and so they geared up to do that.
The second trial would never take place.
Joe Campbell agreed to plead no contest to a charge of negligent homicide. It carries a 20-year sentence, but that sentence was suspended as long as Joe agreed to certain stipulations.
He would have to stay 10 miles away from Falls Creek. He could no longer carry a firearm, I believe, and also he was to sell his property at the site.
He was banished from the land that he killed a man over. For the 20 years that he's on probation, he can't come within 10 miles of that property.
Joe Campbell's reign of terror may be over, but the outcome offers little consolation to friends and family of the victim.
Some of the people who are on Tim Newman's side felt that that wasn't enough, but that was beyond our control. There was people that felt that Joe Campbell shouldn't have got anything, but I believe we did the right thing.
I believe Campbell has no conscience. He had no remorse whatsoever. He'll be facing his God someday.
We think about Tim a lot, especially during hunting season. It's a little bit of a melancholy feeling.
I know he's rusty now, and I'll meet him up there one of these days, probably sooner than I think. Time flies.
操！哎，真不，我说这不是一个级别的，那个，哎，这200不算贵，比北京那便宜。哎，我跟北京跳那个，就刚才你们看那视频，那是一个小湖，你知道吧？那个小湖，你给人感觉吧，反正也挺吓人。我操，这他妈面对整个大海，从他妈那往下跳，远处，哎呦，我操，那制空感，妈吓死个人呀！吓死个人呀！这动漫体验是什么？哦，玩3D 啊！哦，这是玩3D 的。
Wonder if I could bring them to live. I could bring my lover. And baby, you make me wait. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. When you back there again, play the music back there again. I saw the looking out of the window. Wonder if I could bring them down. If I could bring my love now, baby, you make.
Shorty, if you really wanna go, baby, then you gotta take me the mess. I tried to soak in all the years and take it all in, but I come up for a breath and cry. I gave my drama, gave my simple, gave my friends a helping hand. I bet you know that they are dead. I wish I could tell you this. The more we talk, the talk is not a